Listeners, seriously, this is what he's dealing with is really important stuff.
Yes, it is.
You got to pay attention. We need people to pay attention to just these kinds of things, and that's why we're bringing it to you today. Welcome, Professor. You're joining us, and I haven't even had my breakfast yet.
but I'm on a Friday evening in Kuala Lumpur, and it's 8:30.
There we go. So this clearly there was a good reason why we got up early this morning, and you're still up. Although I guess you probably haven't had dinner yet anyway.
I've just finished.
You just finished dinner, okay?
Yeah.
So we're talking today about something that reached our attention through the unusual persona of Prince Charles, the Duke of Cornwall, and the Prince of Wales, and all that stuff. Who's always been very interested in things agricultural. But what was it that attracted his attention? What are the two? There are two organizations here, and how they interact is a little confusing to me.
Two organizations would be Crops for the Future and the Forgotten Food Network, which is not actually an organization. It's an initiative. So if I can take you back a couple of steps, and they're ones that I think everybody should be interested in and certainly should be concerned about, which is in the last, 100 years or so, less than that, we have completely transformed our food system. And what we've done is we've focused on the big crops. We've focused on those crops that actually produce high yields. You know, they can be mechanized. They can produce, yields in good conditions, lots of fertilizer, irrigation, pesticides, herbicides. And of course, those crops are great crops. I don't dispute any of that. But the direction we've moved in is towards making those crops the crops that we actually entirely depend on. And if I give you statistics, which I don't want to spend all this interview telling you about numbers, but one number I would like you to think about is 4 crops, wheat, rice, maize, and soybean, now provide more than 70% of the world's food.
Right. And we're moving
now, Well, monoculture is a separate issue. Monoculture is growing a crop in the field, on its own. What I'm more concerned about is these 4 crops dominate everything everywhere. In other words, whilst they're fantastic crops, we depend on them. 7.5 billion people depend on them for 70% of our food. So we're now in a position where those 4 crops have to feed more and more people. And they have to feed them in lots of places. So we grow them in one place, we take them in long supply chains, and we take them somewhere else. If something happened to any of those crops, all of us suffer because we've actually reduced or removed or marginalized all the other crops, essentially, that have provided food for most of, our human history. So the risk of 4 crops feeding the world is itself self-evident to me, but it's not evident to everybody because we're not aware that just 4 crops are so dominant in the agricultural system and the food systems of the planet.
What could happen?
Now, you might say,
what could happen?
Well, anything could happen. If I just say to you, imagine, I can't tell you anything can happen, but I could tell you if something happened. If something happened to one crop, you're taking out a huge percentage of the food that people eat around the world. If something happened to one of those crops, and we're just 7.5 billion people, and it didn't change, the climate was the same, we'd say, well, okay, that's no problem. We can somehow find, improvements. We can get new varieties. We can improve the production. My concern is we're going to have 9.5 billion people, not 7.5, and we're going to be in a hotter world. Yeah. And my concern is if those 4 crops don't feed 9.5 billion people on a 3-degree hotter planet, what have we done to look at the alternatives? So it's a very straightforward question. If we don't have a plan B, and there's no planet B, so we can't go anywhere else, those 4 crops are going to have to deliver huge amounts of food for lots of people. And that, to me, is a risk.
Yeah,
I just want to add two points. One is the 4 crops don't just feed us, they feed our animals. In other words, we use them for animal feed, and that's another question. Why do we use human food crops to feed animals? And of course, they feed our engines because we use them for biofuel. So we're putting these amazingly, successful and significant crops into a position where the pressure on them is greater than our confidence that they can deliver.
Now, you say on one of the things I saw on your website that one of the issues that you're worried about, which you just referred to along the way without really emphasizing it, is that the climate condition, global warming, whatever word you like to use to describe it, is a very evident threat already. Because of the,
of course it is.
Because of the environment that these core crops require is in itself is disappearing.
What is happening, and of course, almost every country, in fact, all countries but one, as you know, have recognized climate change is reality. I'm not going to say the one country that hasn't, but you know the story.
Yeah, we know.
So the fact is, climate change isn't something in the future. It's not a long way away. It's not even a question. We are feeling climate change. We experience it. The thing that we have not recognized is climate change isn't just the temperature getting hotter, which is a big issue. It's going to get more volatile, and we can feel that. The seasons change, the amplitude, the variability of climates means that the big four crops that grew up and we looked after them for a long time in good conditions, in benign environments, they're going to have to work in very much more volatile and much more hostile environments, and that is a very significant issue because whilst we know that we can provide lots of inputs to those crops, the environments in which they're going to have to grow in, we're going to have to provide even more inputs, we're going to have to put more and more resources in, and large areas of the world simply won't be able to support those big four crops. That's the first issue. The second
hold on just a second.
and this is breaking. So,
if I can say that just a little bit differently.
Please do.
What you're saying is that, if you like, the risk of a failed harvest is much, much higher.
Yeah. It's much higher, and it's much more, it happens in lots of parts of the world. In other words, one failed harvest in Canada or USA or Australia affects people in Africa and India and China because we're importing food. Of course, we're taking food from one place to another. Therefore, it isn't just our local crop, it's our global crop that's actually going to affect, lots of people.
Yes.
The other thing which is breaking, I don't say breaking news, but it's very, very significant, and we're only just discovering this, is that the nutritional content of big crops decreases under climate change. So what we're finding, and this is really, cutting edge science, is when we fumigate fields with carbon dioxide, when we do experiments in real conditions, in actual field crops, and we put CO2 into the atmosphere, what we see is a reduction in the micronutrient content of the big crops.
Oh, that's awful.
Iron. And for that, we have only just discovered that not only does the food and therefore the yield of these crops decrease or become more volatile, more difficult to manage, but their nutritional content goes down. And that is critical, because when people depend on those crops for their nutrition and the nutrient content's going down, just imagine how much we're going to have to eat of those crops simply to provide enough nutrients for us.
It's horrifying, isn't it, when you put it that in that level.
So we figured that part out. That was the easy part. Now the hard part is what we do about it, and I guess that's where the other acronym comes in.
Absolutely, and you're absolutely right. We, first of all, Crops of the Future is a world-first international centre looking at those crops that we have considered to be marginal, alternative, what we call underutilised. In other words, the big crops have all had a home, they've all had a centre, they've all had investment, and good reason. There's no reason why we shouldn't invest in the big crops. However, we haven't till now had a centre that looks at all those alternative crops, and there are hundreds, thousands of those crops. We, as a centre, have an enormous responsibility. We are a centre to look at these alternative crops and to see what their potential is. Not just now, but of course in climates of the future.
Now, you are director of this Crops for the Future?
That's Crops for the Future. And Crops for the Future is a global organization, but it's hosted in Malaysia with enormous support from the government of Malaysia, which has made enormous investment in it, as has the University of Nottingham. So it is whilst it's a company, it has the guarantee of the government of Malaysia and the University of Nottingham. And we have made partners around the world, because it's not going to happen in Malaysia, in one country, for all these alternative crops. We've got to find partners and collaborators and investors who see the potential of these crops in different climates and different conditions with different crops, of course. There's thousands of these crops, and we can't just all work on all those crops in one place. So that is basically what Crops for the Future is. It's a global alliance, this global international network looking at crops that we have really ignored for the last 20, 30, 50, 100 years, but they have been around throughout human history, but have been marginalized and disregarded by modern science and the agri-food industry.
Can you give
so
us
that's Crops for the Future.
Can you give us a couple of examples? I mean, what are these foods? Are they potatoes? Are they carrots?
Sure.
Are they what are they?
No, they are, because they're all big crops. I'll give you one. I'll give you an example that I've worked on, and the reason why I got interested in these crops is I went to work in Africa. I went to work there as a scientist, and I was obviously looking at what I was asked to do, which was to look at the big crops. What I noticed was that local farmers, particularly women, were growing their own crops. They were growing crops that we ignored. They said, we were told, well, these crops are no use. I mean, if they were any good, we'd have discovered them by now. These are the crops that African farmers were conserving and looking after for thousands of years, but mostly in their backyard, mostly women, mostly marginal, mostly in difficult conditions. One crop, Bambara groundnut, was a crop that I saw over and over again throughout sub-Saharan Africa. And I saw it being grown by women farmers to feed their family when the big crops, the maize and the crops that their husbands were seeing as their, the crop, sort of the big crop, the international crop that they were growing. Those crops failed, and the women had to feed their family on crops such as Bambara groundnut, which is drought resistant, it's nutritious, it grows in poor conditions, but it will never have the massive yields that big crops had under good conditions. So Bambara groundnut then became a crop that I got fascinated with, and we've spent a lot of time looking at this crop to find out why has it been ignored, what is the potential, what can we do with it, and we found it's got enormous potential because it's grown in many, many parts of the world. It's not just an African crop. It's actually grown in Southeast Asia. It's even grown in Malaysia. And because we've never looked at it, it's been around for a long time without support, without evidence, without international research effort. And that's a crop that we spent a great deal of time and effort on because it will grow in these very marginal conditions and it's nutritious. And we really have to give it back to the people who've protected it for generations and say, here's a better version of the crop that you've looked after for so long. Here's some products. Here's some uses. Why don't we make this a crop that you could actually grow and get commercial benefit from them rather than just feed your family?
This reminds me of the third plate, Dan Barber's book.
Yes. Yeah.
He identified
absolutely
an old form of wheat that has been being revived a bit through his efforts.
Yeah. Now, that's a related issue. Shouldn't we go back to the ancient varieties and ancestors of wheat and maize and sorrel and other crops that we're familiar with? That's an important job to do, and I don't have a problem with that. That's not our job. Okay. Our job is to look at those other crops, because the other crops have themselves been there's no major research effort on Bambara groundnut till now. But there's huge numbers of land races, farmers' own land races that we can actually select and improve and make.
I've never heard of it. I mean, since I deal with food all the time, that's kind of unusual, but I have never heard of it.
Can you give us an example?
It would be very interesting if, the peanut, which you are familiar with, of course, and Americans have got a great affection for peanut butter. Peanut is a crop that originated in Central America, and it was taken from Central America to other parts of the world, particularly Africa, and it displaced the local African groundnut. So when we say peanut in English usage is called groundnut, and groundnut was brought to Africa, but Bambara groundnut was the local African peanut, if you like.
I see.
And that was the one that got displaced because it wasn't high in oil.
I see.
The problem with Bambara groundnut is it's fully nutritious, it's very resilient, it grows in poor conditions, but it can't sell huge amounts of oil because its oil content is very low, and peanut, of course, has a very high oil content, and therefore edible oil from peanut became a commercial driver. Now we might look at Bambara groundnut completely differently and say, actually, it's got very little oil. That's very nutritious. It's got protein and it's very good for you, and it doesn't have high fat content.
Can you think of
when we started and people started bringing peanut to Africa, it displaced the local African peanut, which was Bambara groundnut.
Professor, can you think of an example of a fruit crop like this that would grow like in the United States or in a European country?
Well, first of all, Bambara groundnut will grow in the United States, and I bet, if you actually go to the website, you'll find Believe in Bambara. There's actually an organization in America looking at Bambara groundnut. But if you actually look at diaspora, if you look at populations that have moved around the world, people must have taken Bambara from Africa to America in history.
Now,
so that's one point.
Yeah, lead us into what captured Prince Charles's attention, and what is this initiative he's launching?
So the second question you asked, one is the organization, Crops of the Future. The other is, how do we capture the interest of the public in these obscure and unutilized crops that they themselves have not heard of very much? And what we set up, which was actually with the endorsement of the Director General of the FAO, Dr. Graziano da Silva, he said he would propose a United Nations year of forgotten foods.
Okay.
And he said, if you could get your forgotten crops to support forgotten foods, that would be fantastic. Let's make a case for a United Nations year to actually celebrate forgotten foods. And we took that initiative, we took that request, and we said, why don't we set up a Forgotten Foods network and actually ask people to do one thing as a minimum, two things as a maximum. One, give us your recipes of the foods that you remember from your past that you no longer eat, you no longer see, no longer find in supermarkets. And what we did was we talked to many people as possible and said, have you got a food from your past that you can remember that we no longer eat? Give us your recipe of that food. And that was how we started the Forgotten Foods Network. Basically, just give us the narrative and the history and the background, but tell us about a food that you no longer eat. Now, the interesting, that really captured the interest of so many people, including His Royal Highness, because everybody's got a forgotten food in our history, haven't we? We've all come from somewhere. We've all got backgrounds. We've got families. We've got mothers and grandmothers and great-grandmothers who all used to do something that we no longer experience. We no longer have that food, and we cherish that. So when we actually go back to our culinary history, we can remember those foods, and our job is to, as a minimum, collect the recipe of those foods that no longer get eaten, but people remember them from their past. And our job as a research organization is to do research on those foods. So it's all right to collect the recipe, that's very useful. But what about the content? What about the nutritional content? What about what's good or bad about those foods? They might be forgotten for a reason, they weren't very good for you. But
who's going to do that?
Forgotten to,
who's going to do that?
Well,
go ahead.
So our job is to investigate those foods, recreate them, and improve them if they need to be improved. But the critical issue is these are forgotten foods that we will need to feed the future. If you remember what I said before, these 4 crops will not be enough to feed the planet.
Right.
We've got to look at other crops. Those are the crops that we've ignored that will actually be around when the climate becomes much more difficult, much more hostile. Those are the crops that we've got to find foods from. And the best place to look for those foods is what did we do with them in the past. And that's our job.
Now, something's happening in April. What is that?
Something's happening in April. I'm not sure what
some sort of
there will be events with next year. Sorry?
I said some sort of a conference, a global gathering of some sort?
We would love to have next year a festival of forgotten foods. What we've got is 2 steps. One is the Director General and the Food and Agriculture Organization saying we should have an international year of forgotten foods. That's up to the individual member countries. We can't announce the international year. We can announce an international festival. What we want to have next year in Malaysia is to ask people to bring their forgotten foods to a festival and celebrate those foods. Bring their celebrity chefs and their cultures and traditions, and bring them all to showcase the foods that they cherish from their past, but people actually don't see anymore outside those local communities that still conserve them. If we could have that festival, we think that would generate global interest in these forgotten foods
and what about
generate
the contact?
a great deal of support.
How about a contact information for this?
Well, I think we could put all of that in. It's all a discussion, to be honest. At this stage, we want to get this Forgotten Foods network out there so people actually give us their recipes and share their recipes, and then we give the recipes back to them and say, this is what your recipe contains. This is what we could do. We could put a new ingredient in that would make it just that bit, tastier or just that bit more nutritious. Once we collect the recipes, we will go back and ask everybody who's donated those recipes to say, now, shouldn't we really be looking at those recipes as becoming part of our diet? Shouldn't we be diversifying diets? Because at the moment, not only do we eat very, very few crops, very few plants that we actually depend on, our diets are so narrow that they depend on just these major crops for almost all of our food now. And we realize now that diversifying the diet is actually the big change that we're going to have to look at in the future. We can't depend on just those 4 crops, not just because they might not be around, because the crops themselves won't be able to sustain us, but narrow diets are not good for our health, and I'm sure you're aware of that. And the big crops will not produce the diet that we need to diversify what we actually consume that we need in the future.
How much work there is?
Need ingredients.
How much work lays ahead of you is just mind-boggling.
I know all about the challenge, but we want. What can I ask you? What the alternative is? Because if we don't do that,
everybody's
and we don't get it right, the 4 crops we've got to change. What we've announced and something which again we've taken an initiative in is we've proposed a global action plan for agricultural diversification. Global action plan for agricultural diversification, GAPAD. What we've proposed is to bring everybody who's interested in agricultural diversification together and address the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals by demonstrating agricultural diversification. If we can do that, we can transform agriculture for good. And that's our, we're incredibly ambitious because we have to, not because we think we've got all the answers, it's just we have to be ambitious because the global food system is not going to, it's creaking at the moment, and if it's broken, we all suffer because we all depend on agriculture. And we need to transform agriculture for good and get away from the yield for profit model that we've been fixated on for so long.
Sure.
And it's not just us. We're just proposing that to build a critical mass of interest to see that food is not just about, putting fuel in our bellies. It's actually culture and tradition and all the other things, and particularly nutrition.
Well, Professor Syed Azam-Ali, I'm not going to let you keep me away from my breakfast very much longer because I'm eating a healthy diet of fresh fruit of the season. And
that sounds very interesting.
I need to go back to that, but I'm so glad that our paths crossed. People want to find out more. There's a website, cffresearch.org, where there's lots and lots of information and lots of pictures. And I'm so glad you're out there.
Yes, I agree.
I wish that the Pennsylvania State University here in the United States was part of what you were doing, but maybe at some point they will be. And
I hope they will. This is an opportunity for all of us to work together. Thank you so much for asking me to speak to you.
Well, thank you.